Call to order the Thursday, October 16th, 2025 meeting of the State Advisory Committee on Historic Preservation. This is a 9-member committee appointed by the governor to review the documentation for all state of Oregon nominations to the National Register of Historic Places. The committee meets 3 times a year to review nominations brought forward by the State Historic Preservation Office. The committee also advises the State Historic Preservation Office on matters of program, policy, and budget. Would like to go around the table and have everybody introduce themselves, please. We'll start with Katie.
Katie Abrams, National Register Coordinator, Oregon Heritage.
Gregory Shine, I'm one of the committee members.
Sarah Monroe, I'm a committee member.
Cassie Rippey, Committee Member.
Heidi Slaybaugh, committee member.
Matt Dietrich, committee member.
Jacqueline Chung, committee member.
Gwendolyn Trice, committee member.
Ian Johnson, deputy state historic preservation officer.
Kim Spivey, Administrative Specialist for Oregon Heritage in SHPO.
Val Ballstrom, Preservation Bureau Assistant for Oregon Heritage.
Wonderful. Thank you, everyone. Restrooms are located at both sides of the building. Both sides, exits on both sides of the building too. And if we have any guests who wish to speak, who would like you to sign in, please, the table by the entry door. Oh, as a reminder, the next meeting of the State Advisory Committee on Historic Preservation will be February 19th and 20th of 2026. Yes, we do not know where yet. Mysterious. Okay. Should be in like Central Oregon. No, won't make you guys drive over the pass in the winter. Katie, are there any members of the public who have submitted testimony cards that are not on the agenda?
No.
Nobody online either?
No.
Okay. Thank you. Next item of business is to review our meeting minutes from June, the previous meeting in June. Are there any questions, comments, additions, modifications? Good. Would somebody like to make a motion to approve the minutes? So moved. Second. Motion and a second. If I remember my training, we need to do approval by name. So Jacqueline? Yes. Matthew?
Approve.
Sarah?
Yes.
Kathy? Approved. Gregory?
Approve.
Gwen?
Approved.
And Heidi? Yes, approved. Right, review of our October agenda. Is our meeting today. Are there any modifications or changes to be made to the agenda? Here, none. Or is there a motion to approve the agenda for today and tomorrow?
Move to approve.
Second.
All right. Jackie? I approve. Matthew?
Approve.
Sarah?
Approved.
Cassie? Approved. Gregory?
Approve.
Gwen?
Approved.
Heidi? Approve. Ian, your
Yeah.
turn.
All right,
As
well,
Mr. Deputy SHPO now.
yes, as of July 1st, so. Well, got a few updates. First, I'd like to welcome Kim Spivey, who you may have talked to on the phone. She is our new admin specialist, so she'll be doing travel and other kinds of things. Do you want to say a little bit?
I'm happy to be here. I previously worked at Silver Falls State Park as the park specialist for the last few years. So this move is a little bit different for me, working at headquarters now. Very happy to be here. And if you ever have questions about your travel stuff, please don't hesitate to reach out to me.
Was very happy to have Kim, and I was especially pleased that Kim came knowing all the contacts within state parks and all of the hidey holes where we put things in all the processes. So it's been a really super fast start. So thank you very much. We had our Oregon Main Street Conference. I saw Heidi there last week. But it was the theme was dedicated to the long game, besides this is sustaining model and staying the course over time. I was in downtown Albany, spread out through 3 buildings. It was a lot of fun. We had sessions and workshops and tours highlighting the value of envisioning how the community wants its downtown look and feel. I didn't get an opportunity to attend too many of the workshops, but the ones I did were a lot of fun. I attended one on idea generation, creative thinking, which gave me some ideas to take into the office. So that was very useful. I also had a chance to hand out awards, and that was a lot of fun to be kind of part of people's, culmination of, lifetime work or large projects and whatnot. So that was a lot of fun too. That was Sherry Stewart, our Main Street coordinator's last meeting. And so it's kind of emotional for her. She got hijacked a little bit on the first day at the end of the award ceremony. Several of the Main Street coordinators kind of put on a little impromptu honorarium for her, gave her an award, had some people speak about her. So that was a lot of fun. About the government shutdown, I'm sure you read the news. We're not sure when the government's going to open again, but it's real uneven who's open and who's not. Some agencies have holdover from the previous biennium and they're still open. Others like BPA are independently funded and they're open. It's even shop to shop, National Park Service Technical Preservation Services, supposed to do the federal tax credit, they're open, but National Register's not. So what we're doing is just seeing who's open, and if they're not open, we're just holding on applications or other type of things. And we won't send them in the day they open. In the past, that's been super not helpful. We generally wait for them to contact, or we reach out and say, are you now ready? Especially the longer the shutdown goes, they have like logistical issues of just getting the doors open, and getting the stuff logged back on. And some folks, their password lapsed, and so it usually takes about 2 to 5 days usually before we get up and running. So we'll keep you apprised of that. Anyone remember the Eastmoreland Historic District? We are down to 1 lawsuit now. And one got resolved. It was heard, for those of you who are new to the Eastmoreland was a problematic historic district out of Portland from about 8 years ago. And we're still winding out all the court cases related to it. And so in the case of Folon versus State Parks, the hearing was on September 11th and got a decision on October 8th. It was basically over wording. The rule was intended to provide an exemption for nominations in process from the provision that said if your nomination went longer than 2 years after return from the Park Service, you had to restart the process. And it's pretty standard, for laws or rule writing to grandfather in things already in process, which is what we did in the rule. The rule used the word division instead of section. And so there was, this lawsuit was all about, well, does division refer to Division 50, which was put into law decades ago? Or does it refer to the updated division, which happened in 2021? And this, it had gone through the courts. They said, we believe OPRD is correct in its interpretation. It refers to when it was updated, it was on appeal, went to the appeals court. They have upheld that. So we'll see if they choose to appeal to the Supreme Court, or the Supreme Court, they get an opportunity to either pick something or not. Or if they appeal to the appeals court again for a redecision. So we'll know on that by the end of the month, or actually next month. And then we have one last case, Brown versus State, challenges the establishment of the State Historic Preservation Office in entirety. So that should be fun. So that one will be coming up. I got a brief on it in November, and then the next phase is each side's going to try and ask for a summary decision. So we'll see kind of what comes out of
Would you
that.
say in its entirety, just like for its existence?
That's my, they're challenging the enabling legislation for the State Historic Preservation Office. So I need to talk to our attorney to find a little bit more about how that's developed over time. This is a case that's been just dragging on for a long period of time. And has been, in November, I will have a conversation with them to pick up exactly where it is at this point and what the repercussions are. So, but I'll update you at your next. I don't expect quick action on this. I have that meeting with the attorney in November. I don't think they're scheduled to take any action on it until early next year. So it's just kind of going very, very slow.
I would love to see what the actual language of their complaint is, like just
Yeah, if I could get that, I'd report that out to you guys, so help Katie do that. I read it, I read the complaint like 2 years ago, and it's a little, honestly, a little fuzzy in my mind, and things have moved on since that time, so. We're recruiting for the committee here, currently position 9, represented Native American community is open. And Katie and I have been chatting with people about that, and we're also looking for one other position. If you happen to know anyone who might be interested or organizations that we could contact, that'd be great. We have a listing up on our website. We're looking for folks with expertise in architectural history, museums and archives, interpretation, and community-based preservation. And someone, of course, who has the time to attend the meetings and to travel. So if you're thinking of anyone, just go ahead and let us know. You can let Katie know. Let's see, last fun item, agency budget impact on SACHP. Again, I'm sure you all watch the news. So federal government has withdrawn a lot of funds from the states, and Oregon's particularly affected. So the state budget's not in great shape, and it's actually expected to deteriorate with the November revenue report. Also deteriorating our lottery funds, which funds a lot of Oregon state parks. We were already looking at an agency deficit of about 15 million. Which we made that up, only to accrue another deficit of about 15 million yen. Several agencies that we were partnering with, their budget strategy has been to either start charging us for things that they were not charging previously, or to withdraw support for other things. So a lot of agencies are kind of just pulling back to core functions. So we are OPRDs under the governor's general order to reduce out of state or eliminate really out of state travel except for when it's absolutely essential, and to reduce all other costs until you get further direction. OPRD, we've got good plans in place. We were actually ahead of the game because we projected the shortfall apart from the federal shortfall. We knew this was coming for a while, so we'd already started to take action prior, so we're in a lot better shape than a lot of agencies as far as that are a little bit more flat-footed on this. The big thing that we're looking at cutting is travel. It's a big piece of it. So for instance, we have a December all managers meeting that'll be online this year for the agency. For this particular group, there's no ban on committee travel, but we'll be looking a lot closer at when we travel and how we do that. Looking at the business, we will do at least one remote meeting a year, and potentially 2, depending on your level of business and what you have to do. So we will travel when it makes sense, and then not when it doesn't. So at this point, I have plenty of budget set aside for all of that. So I just want to give you a heads up. There's going to be that extra level of consideration of decisions. No, we're not going to ask you to float your own meals and hotel. We'll still be paid for all those things. So, any questions or about either topics I addressed or anything? Right, thank you very much.
Okay, next on our agenda is an operational check-in and feedback session. Katie, you're leading this?
Thank you, Heidi. And morning, everyone. It's a much more professional setup than we've done. It's getting easier. So we're gonna keep things up today with a little bit of housekeeping. It's been over a year now since I joined SHPO and became your board administrator partner. And now that we've had a couple of meetings together, we started to settle into a routine around the meetings and communications. I wanted to have a kind of cause my community check-in where you can let me know how things are going. And while we're all together, I also wanted to touch base on a key operational item too that affects all of us, and that's your workday trainings. So I'm going to start by reviewing how and where to find those trainings. That'll be pretty quick. But several of us, including me, need to finish up at least one training by the end of the year. So I just wanted to give you all a refresher. And then I want to open up the floor for you to share anything that has or hasn't been working for you, any ideas that you have. Yeah, share the stream. Testing.
Okay, sorry, everybody. Yeah, real quick, the light is off. Testing. Okay, we're gonna move forward with that. Yeah, in summary, basically, I just want to make sure these meetings above and beyond meeting our statutory requirements are working well for both you and for our preparers. So starting with Workday, you can get to Workday from a direct link that I'll send around in my post-meeting email, or you can get to it just by Googling Workday Oregon, and it should be the first thing that comes up. So you click on that link, and on the page that opens, you click this yellow button on the right that says log into Workday, and that'll open this page. Most of you, Cassie and Matt aside, will be logging in from your personal computers. So you'll click on sign in using a personal device at the bottom left, which will open your login screen where you put in your username, which starts with the letters OR, and your password. And if you don't have one or both of these, that's totally fine. You can always email me or call me and I can look up your OR number and send that to you. I can also reset your password for you from the back end, so that's no problem. Once you have those two pieces of information typed in, click sign in. Workday takes you to this screen, which is the real bugaboo of this, and that asks for a security code. This is something I learned when I was putting this PowerPoint together, but two-factor authentication means that logging in requires something you know, something that's static, in this case, your password, and something you have, which in this case is a dynamic security code that appears in an app on another device that you then have to input on this screen to confirm your identity. And to get that second factor, you need to have downloaded one of these two apps on a smartphone or tablet. Those are Microsoft Authenticator or Google Authenticator. I use the Microsoft one, so I'll be better able to help you troubleshoot if you have that one, but they both work pretty much the same way, so you get to choose. We have some instructions for getting these installed and set up that I think I sent around to the people who have more recently been confirmed to the SACHP, but I'll send those around again after this meeting in case you have to do that still. But the idea is once you get one of these set up, when you get to the screen on Workday that asks for a 6-digit security code, the app will send a notification to your device with that code. So you enter that. And that should finally take you to your Workday account. After all that, you're finally there. To get to your trainings, you click on menu at the top left, which opens a panel of options. This is my Workday, so yours might look a little different from mine. Oh, I just heard Matt say he uses this, so you can call him with your IT questions.
I use it a lot. I'm not saying I'm good at it.
I think you volunteered.
So the two-factor,
Yeah, thanks.
Something I know.
Thank you, Chair Slaybaugh.
Really annoying. Something I have is a big pet peeve.
Yeah. Once you're finally here though, you click on learning and you'll get to this page where any trainings that you need to take will be right up front under required for you. One important thing that I wanted to share, I have you all together, is that if you notice that there are trainings in your queue that don't seem to make sense for your role, so something like park area rule enforcement or defensive driving, things that you wouldn't be doing in your capacity as an SACHP member, check in with me before you do those, because sometimes Oregon Parks makes mistakes and blanket assigns things. So you'll have things in your queue that were maybe meant more for Val and Ian and Kim and I. So I've been emailing the Workday folks, asking them to remove those trainings from your queue, but until they're able to do that, please do your trainings, but do them with like a healthy level of skepticism about what's assigned for anything that seems off topic. The primary training that you should be looking for is called the annual board/commission member required training. So that one's pretty clear. I'm available, like I said, for over the phone troubleshooting. Reach out to me and we can schedule something. And failing that, we've got some great IT people that I know I've connected a few of you with in the past. But for now, are there any kind of general questions for Matt about Workday learning? If I can't answer them now, I'll take them down and I can ask the Workday people too and email you all after. Okay, if you think of anything, reach out. So we have a few minutes left, and I'd be really grateful now to hear any suggestions or feedback you have on these meetings. That includes communications outside of the meetings, the materials that we send you, the format of those materials, training topics, anything that you'd like to see us revise and grow in. Ian's already talked a little bit about meeting location. We are a little limited in that, but I'm still really glad to gather your ideas.
I'll start. I absolutely love it when we do tours of buildings that are on the National Register or it's a project that we're looking at a nomination for. Also just, you know, the Main Street grants and seeing where the other grants are going to projects. So that's been really fun in the past, viewing those, seeing hands-on work being done with the funding. So those are very enlightening to me. And you providing things like this with this color-coded narration of what we need to say and when in these meetings, and the preparations you do for me for these meetings is amazing. So keep that up by all means. That's just the godsend.
We have Katie Henry of Oregon Heritage Commission to thank for the color-coded one this time. I will pass that along. Thanks, Heidi.
I also really enjoy hearing what else is going on in the state and the other commissions. So I like this meeting in particular, so we know as a collective whole what all is going on. It makes me feel a lot more involved statewide, not just with National Register nominations, but heritage in general. I'd like to be able to see if there's more advocacy we can do as part of our group.
Thank you. Does anyone have any training topics they might want to see? We talked about this in October of last year, actually, and I'm kind of getting to my end of the list of things that were suggested then. So I'm always looking for new trainings that you're interested in, and if there are other folks that we can bring in that you'd like to hear from, we can do that too.
It's just good to see us have this work day stuff in front of us, because it's the most frustrating part of all of it. Getting in, finding, getting in, staying in, all of the above. At one point it came back to me and said, congratulations, you're a new employee. Do this to sign into your job. So it's wonderful for this meeting to see it up in front of us so that we can engage as a group and face it together.
Thanks, Gwen. Okay.
Everything else we said, Mike.
Yeah, I agree, but I enjoy going to look at the different properties and learning about them.
Are there particular property types that like training on? And, you know, there's a lot of nuance to different types of property. So for instance, National Park Service has ocean something in the more wonky, like aircraft, cemeteries, other kinds of more specific guidelines for things we're looking for. Are there properties that you're seeing come across that you're like, gee, I'd like to maybe to have a little bit of training on how to work with those a little bit better? Cultural landscapes, yeah.
Probably the multiple properties.
Your wish is my command.
There's something that flagged that in my mind. I mean, any part of the variety, right? Seeing projects that are the diamonds in the rough, or learning how people get funding
and get a project together and our involvement in it. And then how they take it in. That is just amazing. We toured Albany, not Albany, Astoria, and we learned about that, of the affordable housing and how like they had 5 different jurisdictions that came together to help fund that project to make them happen. It's just, oh, how do you even start? Like that's so impressive.
If you're interested, you could have, Sears come and talk about the back end administrative piece, like, less exciting than physics, but talking about what, how we pull in the grants, how we process the evaluate process. And Joy's follow-up, part of these grants are successful, Joy, Sears in our office, and other staff follow up regularly, but make sure we stay on track, not just about getting the project done, unfortunately. It was much about getting it done on time and having all the paperwork in it. So that's a big piece of it. If you're interested, you can ask them to, get machine. Yeah, I consider that. The other training we've done in the past, well, we tend to do it just before you need, or especially when they're good size. We may be having one of those, we got to incorporate, so to see if that pans out, but, if you have one of those, a good size, what about every 12 to 18 months? Documents like. Do that ahead of time or just before it comes up, whatever.
I would say anytime we can get a training in a meeting prior to the meeting, instead of, I know sometimes we've done a training in the same meeting, yes, and then it's like, oh, I mean, there's a lot of maybe stress that goes into reviewing those, especially if you're the designated presenter. And so to have that training beforehand, before we have to come to this meeting and prepare for that, really helpful.
I think we can do that for this districts, and if they have a lot of prep time, they not that. There's going to be a bomb material. So I think we should be able to reasonably get you in.
It might also just be good to maybe sometimes do your trainings on like specific criteria, like integrity is one that's particular to the issue sometimes that maybe just need to focus on those kinds of.
Yeah, we can do 7 aspects.
Well, yes,
All that various things. The criteria. There's some very so there's the great thing about the national registry is you're never going to run out of things that topics and things to think about, right? History keeps moving on and every property is unique. So anything you really think of it on right all over right on. Things internally in staff, we do Robert or me, but our last series, we do run a series of nominations, and we talked about so it could be linear resources, had really had a new one on what I call on. Here's a statue, here's a submarine. It's just like kind of those things that are not buildings, like, okay, those fit in the form too. And here's different approaches. So if there's a theme that you're saying, like, we'd like to look at the year historic districts, or we'd like to look at the industrial building, or just as a grouping, or like we get a lot of ranch and farm complexes, which are basically rural factories. They're really rural. That's very expensive. Different ways of documenting them. We could rotate cities of those through different criteria, creation, other kind of thing. So if there's whatever you might need. Preservation briefs would be helpful too.
Yeah, especially as we're reading through nominations and looking at alterations and how the alterations might affect integrity, and having a better understanding of how to apply those preservation briefs would be helpful in putting that in sort of the context of like this quality. It does the integrity still rise to the. Right, that helpful. Yeah, it's exercise.
Before you go to training, you're doing a great job.
Thanks, Missy. And I have lots of ideas for the next meetings. Sorry, Greg.
I found these, the best practices reviews really helpful that you all have sent out, and I don't know if you get a heads up what the topics will be for them when they're released, something in advance or something, but it's nice. I find those valuable, and perhaps there could be a training associated with a new one that's coming out. So yeah, here's the new PPR, here's some ability in Oregon, here's some things for us to think about beyond what's in the handout.
Sounds great. Okay. If something comes to you later, please feel free to email that to me directly, and then at our next meeting in February, we can read that into the record too. So thanks, these are really good ideas. Now, if it's okay with Chair Slaybaugh.
Let's move on to our training.
Okay, so today's training is on multiple property documents, just like you asked for. Thanks, Heidi. So we've reviewed several of these in the past year, most recently the one for Methodist mission sites that Greg led the review of in February. And currently we at SHPO are working with a consultant to produce one that's focused on Oregon women's labor history. So you can look forward to seeing that one probably around this time next year, as well as a couple of nominations associated with that. So for this training, I'm just going to give you a brief overview, and then I'm going to hand things over to Matt and to Sarah to talk about their experiences writing and working with MPDs. So for my part, I'll start by sketching out what MPDs are and how they work as tools that can support National Register evaluations and nominations. Then I'll cover the differences between MPDs, historic contexts, and historic district nominations. Then I'll highlight the number and scope of MPDs that currently exist that can be used to nominate properties in Oregon. And finally, I'll identify some things you want to look for when you're reviewing both MPDs and nominations that are written underneath them. So what is an MPD? I like to think of MPDs not so much as what they are, but what their purpose is. So an MPD is a type of tool. You can think of it as a reference guide, a guidance document that has been developed to provide a consistent framework for identifying, evaluating, and nominating groups of related historic properties to the National Register. So when we think about this idea, this groups of related properties, those are groups of properties that are related by context, which we talked about last meeting, and also by property type. So those two ideas, context and property type, make up the two major components of an MPD form. And these are officially called associated historic contexts and associated property types. For each of the associated property types, the MPD provides a set of tailored guidelines called registration requirements. And those help determine whether the resources that fall into that property type category are eligible for the National Register. So an MPD functionally is kind of like a crib sheet for nomination. So instead of having to start from scratch with a historic context, you've got a lot of general information already available to you in that associated historic context section. And then instead of having to start from the beginning with an eligibility argument, the registration requirements spell out for this particular type of property associated with this particular historic context, if it meets these particular registration requirements, then it's eligible for the National Register. Just as important as knowing what an MPD is knowing what an MPD is not, because in your reviews, if you get an MPD and it seems to be trying to do something that is not the purpose of an MPD, that's something you want to call out before we send that to the Park Service. So first, an MPD is not the same thing as a historic context, or it's not just a historic context, right? Because it includes that associated property types piece with the associated registration requirements. So not only does an MPD provide the historic context, it requires, or it provides the requirements for nominating properties that are associated with that context. Second, an MPD does not make something eligible for the National Register. If it doesn't have the significance or integrity to meet National Park Service thresholds, having an MPD doesn't automatically make everything that's associated with that context eligible. An MPD can facilitate an eligibility determination in the ways I just mentioned, but it doesn't create eligibility where there is none. So that was a long way to say that, but I think another way to think about this is that just because a property is related to one of those associated historic contexts, and just because it fits into one of the property types, it's not automatically going to be listed. It has to meet the registration requirements too. Because of that, this is why I like to think of NPDs not exclusively as tools for nomination, although they can't help with that, but really as tools for evaluation. Because when we're talking about nominations, that evaluation step has to come first. We only want to nominate things that are eligible. And finally, an NPD is not the same thing as a historic district evaluation, and one can't be substituted for another as a way to kind of get around listing a whole district. A historic district, it's a unified group of resources. It's usually contiguous or pretty close, and those collectively convey significance. So resources that are significant as components of the district, we categorize them as contributing or non-contributing. They either contribute to that overall significance story or they don't. But you can't just list a single resource for the significance of the group, because it's the group as the collective that conveys the story. An NPD, on the other hand, that provides context and evaluation guidelines for property types across locations that share a common theme, so they don't need to be contiguous. And then each nomination written using an NPD has to demonstrate the significance of that resource. It does get a little confusing because you can have a district that's eligible under an NPD. So this Peacock Lane Historic District in Portland, if you remember that one, that's actually listed under a nationwide NPD for American residential suburbs. But what you couldn't do is use that NPD to list just one house on Peacock Lane individually for its significance representing an early automobile suburb, because again, that one house on its own doesn't tell the whole story, right? You need the whole neighborhood as a collective. Does that make sense? I'm sorry, this microphone's really throwing me off.
So would you have both an MPD and a historic district?
So in this case, the MPD is the tool. It doesn't actually get listed, but it was a tool that was used to help list this historic district. You can absolutely list historic districts on their own without the aid of an MPD. It's just that we have that nationwide MPD for American residential suburbs, so it's been used a few times in Oregon. I think
You'll often see historic district as a property type in the NPDs where they're.
the format of MPDs, like National Register nominations, is standardized. They use a National Park Service form called a 10900B. Not something you need to know, but it looks a lot like the regular National Register nomination form that you're familiar with. Has 9 sections, and in a regular, individual National Register nomination form, those are numbered. In the NPD form, they're lettered. So section A is the title of the listing, and I think this is actually a cool thing to talk about following our context training, because it often, not always, but often includes the same 3 parts that we talked about at the last meeting as being the 3 parameters of a historic context. Does anybody remember any of those? The three boundaries you need to draw your context? One of them is theme. One of them is geographical area, and one is time period. So taking like residential architecture in Eugene, for example, that theme or topic is residential architecture, the location is Eugene, and then the time period is 1850 to 1950. So it's got all 3 of those parameters of a historic context, and it tells us nice and succinctly what kind of resources are going to be covered in that NPD. Section B is called Associated Historic Contexts, and it's kind of like a table of contents for the historic context portion of the document. So for example, in the African American Resources in Portland from 1851 to 1973 MPD, the document breaks up this like massive topic, Black history in Portland, spanning over a century, into 7 different contexts, 7 more focused topics, including things like settlement patterns, Black journalism, and civil rights. This is followed by section C, which is just the preparer information. It's the same as section 11 in an individual nomination form. And section D, which is where the deputy SHPO and the keeper of the National Park Service, keeper of the National Register, signs the document to certify it. And then next is like the real meat of the document. These are the two components that I talked about up front. The first is section E, the statement of historic context, which includes all of the actual historic context that were listed on the front page. In section B, that kind of table of contents section. And the second is section F, the associated property types, which includes registration requirements, both general ones that apply to all the property types that are outlined by the nomination. I'm sorry, the MPD, and then ones that are specific to individual property types. Those registration requirements, they can relate to like what kind of historical associations a property has, what physical characteristics it has, what aspects of integrity a property retains. Matt and Sarah are probably going to talk a little bit about the requirements that their MPDs included. The point of the registration requirements is that they give some guidance for evaluating properties under a particular criterion and area of significance. After the associated property types in section E, we're just going to blow through these last ones. We've got section G, which describes the geographical area covered by the MPD. So for the Methodist mission sites in Oregon country, the geographical area encompassed all of those different potential sites that could be listed under that MPD. Next is section 8, which is a methodology that explains how the registration requirements were determined and how the survey was done, how the context was developed. It usually includes an explanation of how the authors of the documents identified enough properties associated with the context so that they could make informed decisions about what the registration requirements are. And finally, section I, which is just the bibliography. And like we saw with the Oregon, with our most recent MPD, right, there can be figures at the end too. So at least one nomination always needs to be submitted with an MPD when it's a new MPD. And that's kind of a proof of concept to show how those registration requirements are going to work. So this one that we most recently looked at, that one, right, was submitted alongside a nomination for the Mill Place house site in Salem. And that one we could refer back to the MPD to make sure that they were speaking to each other. After an MPD has been submitted and approved by the National Park Service, it can be used again and again and again to support nominations. There's no cap or expiration. You can keep adding to it over time. And that, the MPD, and then any of the National Register nominations that are associated with it, no matter when they were submitted, those are collectively called a multiple property submission, or an MPS. So there are two acronyms we're working with here. When someone says MPD, it's just that reference guidance document that tells you how to evaluate something. And then MPS is the MPD and then all of the nominations associated with it. It's for this reason that some people also call MPDs cover documents, because they're like the document that sort of binds all of those other nominations together.
Are you done? I was gonna wait. I was just,
Oh, it's okay.
Oh.
Yeah, please.
you know, two things that I've always trained staff on, I think that they can, as these, I think it's good for me. Is looking at section H first, because if you don't trust the methodology, or that section 90 bibliography, you don't trust the resources they're using, you don't trust the methodology, how they did their surveys, then that's kind of your way into evaluating the residents. So the I think the example Katie used for residences in Eugene, you would expect to see discussion of how what neighborhoods they surveyed, how thoroughly they surveyed them, how recent that is. The other thing too, and I see this all the time with NPDs, is section E is a fantastic story, but then you get the registration rights and the buildings and the property types just appear out of nowhere. You're like, I had no idea they. So it's like, where did this property type come from? Where did that property type come from? The context should introduce all of the buildings and all of the property types, not 1, 2, 3, Winter Street, but you're like, oh, it talked about residents. Oh, it talked about it talked about the kinds of different things. And so I like to say when you get to section F, which is very long, and the Park Service has as a reduction. Well, of course, and of course, this is how the context should be laying all of that out. I think the way section E is sometimes written, it's a fantastic story,
But then they're trying to introduce all the property types and why they're important all the way in section F instead of kind of getting to that summary. Type of it. And again, we wouldn't expect lists necessarily, sometimes you see, but they wouldn't expect lists in section E. Or calling out specific property types or properties that they find in section F. But it shouldn't feel like, wow, where was that in section? So.
Thanks, Ian. So here in Oregon, we've got more than 50 MPDs that encompass all kinds of things, all kinds of themes. You've seen some of them that we can use to nominate Oregon properties. So architecture, community planning and development, and commerce and industry are the most common themes. But we also have MPDs that cover archaeology, engineering, and politics, and social and ethnic history themes like the history of Black Oregonians. Some of those MPDs are specific to a particular region of Oregon or to a county or a city, like that residential architecture of Eugene one that we talked about. Some cover related resources across the whole state or across multiple states, like the Methodist Missions MPD. We've got a couple of architect MPDs too that do that. And then there are a couple of MPDs that even have a national scope, which means they can be used to evaluate resources relevant to their themes anywhere in the country, like that residential American suburbs one. There are about 500 properties and districts in Oregon right now that have been listed listed using MPDs. And those are distributed all over the state, mostly concentrated in the Willamette Valley though. Okay, now I'm going to talk about what to look for in a review of a new MPD. I actually want to shout out Greg on this a little bit because when he was looking at the Oregon Country Methodist Missions MPD, he reached out and asked me this question, and it was really good for me to start thinking about this from your perspective. So not just as a preparer putting together the MPD, but what to look for when you're trying to evaluate it. So the first thing that I recommend is to familiarize yourself with the National Park Service publication Bulletin 16B, how to complete the National Register Multiple Property Documentation Form. So this is that partner to 16A, the one that I send around a lot that's about how to just fill out the form. If you'd like to see examples, which is something Sarah's going to talk about in her experience, there are some available on the National Park Service website, which are good to look at because you know that they're holding those up as good examples. And you can also search our database or reach out to me and I can find you some examples that are specific to Oregon. I know I always like to see these. It's good to see how other people are laying out their context, how they're delineating those, and how they're defining different property types and determining requirements that go along with them. I also want to plug our new Oregon Heritage Bulletin on MPDs. That's included in all of your packets. This is pretty new. This is more for preparers and people working with MPDs or writing nominations using MPDs, but it's a nice general overview. Okay, as far as what to look for when you're viewing, I think the most important thing to keep in mind is that MPDs are tools for evaluation. To make an evaluation, you need to have sufficient context, you need to have appropriately identified property types, and you need to have clear registration requirements. So those all need to work together for the document to be useful for somebody who's trying to evaluate a property for National Register eligibility and to complete a nomination. And our goal is that these MPDs will be useful so that they can be used again and again by people trying to list properties. So I think it can be helpful to try to put yourself in the shoes of a user of the MPD. So somebody who comes to it with a relative or relevant property and needs to use its context, its property types and registration requirements to build the nomination. If you came to that MPD, would you know which sections to look? Would you find the material you're looking for? It's also critical, I think, to look at the MPD and the nomination or the nominations that are submitted along with it as a complete package. Because the nomination is a product of the MPD. So you need to make sure that the MPD is giving it enough support. I'm going to break it down by sections, but before I do that, those of you who've reviewed MPDs, do you have any tips or anything that you've taken away from your experience looking at them?
I haven't done enough.
Yeah.
So when they come up, I was unfamiliar and have a lot of training and it's come up, I think, another time since then. which brought to mind, for me, there was a thing PT that was beginning or in process that, because I know the African American one that was for Portland was done. But there was supposed to be another one that there was funding for African Americans around the state of Oregon. Did that happen? Yeah, that.
I was really fuzzy on the dates.
I think it was June 2024, right before I started. Yeah, I think it's tough because they're also different based on the context, the registration requirements and property types really vary. Okay.
You have it listed, but using that, the nomination that's with it is super helpful and kind of helps point me toward that environment.
Section by section, I'm just gonna give you a couple questions to think about on each one. So thinking about section E, the statement of historic context, you want to ask yourself if the NPD provides adequate context to evaluate the significance of the properties. This is what Ian was saying earlier. If you get back there, is anything missing? And then also, does it do a good enough job establishing that that context is actually significant? So this is something that we talked about last meeting when we talked about context and the importance of demonstrating the significance of the context itself, as well as the significance of the property within that context. So it might be just like a really cool history and really fun to read, but has it established that it is significant? In section F, the associated property types section, you want to evaluate whether the NPD adequately defines the property types that can be eligible within those section E contexts. So kind of to take it another way, like I said earlier, if you were tasked with evaluating the eligibility of a particular property type under this NPD, would you be able to tell which set of registration requirements you need to look at? Are those registration requirements clearly delineated? And are there any property types that seem to be missing too? Because that could cause problems down the line. I've had that using NPDs where I think, man, this fits in the context. It would be really great to use this NPD, but it's hard to fit it into one of those property types. So those are all things to consider. Getting into the registration requirements, which I know I've said those words many times now, but I personally think those are where an NPD's ability to streamline future nominations really lies. So I think they're really, really important. Do the general and specific registration requirements clearly explain what criteria a property would need to meet to be eligible? That seems really obvious, but it's really important to get it right. So like I mentioned earlier, that, and like Greg said, that nomination that gets submitted along with an NPD is a great litmus test, especially for this section. So when you're looking at that nomination next to the NPD, is it clear how that property fits into the requirements? And are the requirements reasonable? Do they make sense? If they're really broad and they don't really effectively establish comparative significance, or if they're really narrow and they're really exclusive, or if they're veering really far from the established national register thresholds, all of those things can be problems because weak or clunky or vague registration requirements are going to make that NPD less usable. Section G, pretty straightforward. Does the geographical data make sense? Is the boundary drawn to include all the resources that could be eligible under that NPD? I learned something recently when we were doing the Methodist Mission Sites one. I talked to our reviewer at the National Park Service and was like, well, we've only got, 7 sites. They're really far apart. Could we have a discontiguous boundary in section G? And he said no. So keep that in mind. And then finally, section H, Ian already talked about this, so I won't linger on it, but it's all about that methodology. And it's a really great section for our archaeologists to review because they're all really experienced in articulating methodologies. You want to think about whether it's adequate for a reader to understand how that data was collected and how they were making the decisions that they made. If any of that is unclear, it's a really good idea to ask for clarification before we send it off to DC to be reviewed.
Go back one to the boundary.
Yeah.
So if we're talking about like, Glenn was just bringing up like Black heritage in Oregon, is the boundary the state of Oregon?
Yes. Yeah, it can be really broad.
It could be multi-state too, as well. You just have to coordinate the other states on the reservation. So that Methodist Mission NPD is working in Washington. Did that get listed in Washington? It's not like, yeah, it'll fight for that state.
Yeah, so it got accepted. It didn't actually list anything in Washington, so it was a little different process up there. But we've done it the opposite way too. I think I wasn't here at the time, but I think the architecture of Donald J. Stewart MPD, that one was one that the Washington SHPO, DAB, they were kind of taking the lead on, since they were listing the nomination that was being submitted with that MPD was in Washington. But the SACHP did review that one too, I believe, right?
I believe so, yeah.
We have a question from the audience.
Sorry. I just wanted to point out too that boundaries, like physical boundaries with an MPD, you have to look at those really closely, as a reviewer. So when, like, there's one for the city of Portland, it's one that kept popping up all the time, and its boundaries, might have been a downtown one, I'm not sure.
It was.
The boundary stopped at I-405 in Portland. And so there were all these associated property types that were outside, just across the freeway. It's like, that really didn't make sense, and it was hard to use because of it. So just keep an eye if you see a physical boundary, make sure it's inclusive enough for its purpose.
Yeah, and this is another good reason to look at that section H and how their survey was performed, because that will tell you if they've done a comprehensive job and considered the boundary appropriately. Got one more slide for you, and then I'm going to give it over to Matt and Sarah. So reviewing nominations written under existing MPDs, we've had a few of these recently. Our most recent one was for the Salem substation, and then for the Mingus Park Community Building. We looked at both of those in February. For these, you want to focus on how the preparer is presenting the nomination, or the relationship, I'm sorry, between the nomination and the MPD. So you're going to want to go back and read the MPD to make sure that this fits in. So things I think that are good to consider. Is it clear how the property fits into one of those associated property types in section F, or is it kind of an outlier and you're not totally clear on how it fits in, how it's related, if it's even appropriate to be using this MPD? So with the Mingus Park Community Building, the preparer identified the building as an example of the entertainment and recreation property type that's laid out by the MPD. And that particular MPD has a lot of subtypes, and one of those was lodges and cabins. And this was something that we went in to check because this building did have a lot of different uses. But the nomination backed up its decision to file it into that property type by describing how the property fit the definition that was given in the MPD. So in this case, that was constructed by WPA or PWA laborers in the period described by the MPD and used as a lodge by the local scouting troop and other community organizations. Second thing, does the nomination explain how the property meets all the general and property type specific registration requirements? This is usually done in a separate subsection. It's we in Oregon usually put it at the top of section 8. So it's easy to find, but you still want to make sure that each registration requirement is met and that the nomination explains how and why the property meets each one. It's not enough to just say it does meet it. So I've got that example from Mingus Park Community Building nomination. So it's a little hard to read, it's a little small, but the idea is that it walks through first those general registration requirements. And then in this case, there was only one specific registration requirement. So when you get to this section, you want to turn to section F of the associated MPDs and compare them, make sure that each necessary requirement was covered and none were skipped, and that the rationale makes sense. And finally, consider whether the nomination adequately references the context from the MPD, but without repeating it. So this is something that our reviewer talks about too. MPDs are tools that support nominations, and because the MPS has already accepted them, they don't actually want us to cut and paste or overly paraphrase that section E information in the nomination. The idea is that the MPD streamlines nominations, so they should be a little bit shorter most of the time. So over reference isn't a reason to table a nomination. This is kind of like what we talked about last meeting with the context. If there's too much, it's not usually a reason to say no, but it's something that you want to call out probably as a revision for the sake of keeping our submittals to the Park Service tight and concise. I'm gonna hand things over to Sarah and Matt for their presentations. Got about 40 minutes left. And then when we're done, if you have any questions, I'd love if you want to share those. So for now, I'm gonna welcome Sarah up to talk about her experience writing an MPD. I'll switch here. Oh.
Thank you, Katie. Can you hear me? Good. So in 2020, when Chrissy Curran asked me to develop an MPD form for the New Deal resources in the state of Oregon, I knew almost nothing about the use of MPDs really the national register process anymore. I had over previous, decades ago, written or been peripherally involved with several national register nominations, such as the Pelota Fronton in Jordan Valley, Albertina Kerr Nursery, and Silcox Hut. But the National Register process had developed a lot over those same decades, and I had a large learning curve. It was an advantage that I had years of involvement with Friends of Timberline, researching and writing several histories and organizing a panel at McMinimans on the New Deal, which Chrissy participated in. That was in 2012, creating a couple of exhibits for the 75th anniversary of the New Deal in 2007, and a symposium in labor arts forum in 2004 that included papers presented by scholars from throughout Oregon. So bolstered with this background, I delved in. So creating the MPD was supported by a grant from Restore Oregon. Robert Olguing from SHPO's review and compliance historian supervised the project. SHPO provided me with background, including relevant MPDs from other states, and recently completed MPDs in Oregon. In addition to reviewing similar MPDs, I used the NPS, National Park Service Bulletin 16B that Katie had referenced, which it was written in 1992 and has not been revised since 1999. And I engaged in extensive historical research on the New Deal. And early in the process, we decided to limit the scope of the document to Public Works Administration and Works Progress Administration resources in Oregon. Specifically, this meant that the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps resources, were excluded and were to be undertaken later in a separate document. A second limitation was forced upon us by the COVID shutdown, and it meant that many resources were closed and off limits. And so much of the inventory work was done online. So survey, whoops. When I looked at the MPDs from other states, these were the states. Can you read that at all? These were the states that I looked at. And one of them, I'm just going to call out a couple of them. The Minnesota State Park and it has an MPD that covers CCC WPA rustic style historic resources. And the only part there that they divided into 4 parts, 4 historic contexts, only one of which deals with New Deal resources. The CCC, WPA, federal relief programs in MSP from 1933 to 1942. And Minnesota also adopted another MPD that was specifically on federal relief construction, 1933 to 1941. I was interested also in the South Dakota registration requirements, the integrity was divided into the 7 aspects, but the aspect of workmanship required that the resource retain evidence of federal relief workers' labor and skill, as well as its original design and materials. It also leaves open the possibility a resource could qualify under criterions B or D. The Oregon MPD that we adopted is limited to qualifying under criterion A and C. So I also was referred to several Oregon MPDs, and among those were the City Beautiful, which has under it a multiple property submission, Laurelhurst Park pictured here, and other MPSs, of course, are possible, encouraged. The Oregon Trail, which Stephen Dow Beckham completed, is an enormous MPD and covers a huge variety of resources, mile by mile of the Oregon Trail, with a lot of depth. And then the African American resources, which Katie referred to, and covers a wide chronological span, and is a recent MPD and focused on an underserved population. The challenge in that MPD was providing a shape that addressed a large time span. So this is the outline of historical development that was developed in this MPD that I drafted. And as a result of that, we selected developed two historic contexts: the Social and Cultural Association through the New Deal program that funded its construction or improvement, and then the second, art, architecture, and landscape architecture reflected in New Deal resources. The significance under criterion A was for association with social history, economic effects, and of financial reform and/or governmental regulations that enabled them to be built. And the benefits of these were work relief, the numbers of workers employed on projects. The majority of PWA workers were carpenters, and next in number were bricklayers. Just as an example, in Portland, over 25,000 workers were employed under the WPA. So that had a widespread benefit really for the time. A second benefit was infrastructure resources. The roads generated the greatest amount of WPA funds. There were 5,949 miles reported of highway construction and roads and streets built and improved by June 30th of 1943. That was reported in the final report of the Oregon WPA. And thirdly, it provided a boost to local economies. About a third of the total amount spent under the the PWA was spent in the West. This is not always widely perceived by Westerners who are convinced that the New Deal funds were all spent in the East. Hydroelectric projects accounted for about 10.4% of PWA funds, and there was a terrific boost to morale. As an example of that, I found in the supervisor of the woodworking shop at Timberline for the furniture at Timberline, Ray Newfer said, most of the men came in from construction projects and they didn't know they could do some of the things they did. Most of them had been out of work for a long time, then on construction jobs, and they had lost their self-confidence. So this is addressing the second historical context. And there are several major styles that were used in New Deal buildings. Significance here is under criterion C for distinctive characteristics of art, architecture, landscape architecture, and engineering associated with New Deal construction. Another thing I found is that resources that apply to New Deal MPDs also overlap with other MPDs or other studies. As an example of other surveys, the bridges, which had been surveyed by Robert Hadlow, have a number of have separately been have national register status, and the Main Street resources in historic districts such as Bonneville, which is a PWA project, have also been separately listed. But there are great varieties of resources from outhouses to courthouses. I'm sorry. What is PWA? I'm sorry.
Yeah. You're saying
Public Works Administration.
public, okay.
That is the two big projects. I was just going to identify those just now. So this was accomplished, this research through the online version of the online Oregon Historic Site Database was a great resource, and then a small amount of actual survey. It was not always easy to identify or isolate New Deal work. PWAs versus WPA projects were often blended. But generally, PWA projects in Oregon included most of the post offices, courthouses, dams, transmission lines, and bridges constructed in the state from between 1933 and June of 1943. PWA projects were generally operated with skilled laborers, competitive bidding for contractors, and online supervision by architects. WPA work, in contrast, was administered at the state level through the State Emergency Relief Administration, or the state WPA office, which was headed by Emerson J. Griffith. Unlike the PWA, WPA projects tended to employ unskilled workers who were trained on the job by teaching supervisors rather than the architects sometimes that PWA had. The WPA built projects by paying directly for labor and materials. WPA projects included many smaller local buildings such as administration buildings, offices, libraries, transmission systems, flood control projects, tunnels, roads, agricultural projects, and arts, music, and theater, writing, or historic surveys. All New Deal resources share attributes of significance and registration requirements by association with public work relief projects that provided employment for unemployed people and provided hope in the face of the Great Depression. So this kind of is a list of the property types. I don't know if you can see all of them. They just include a lot of the things I just mentioned. But criteria considerations included the area of significance, the level of significance, period, and integrity. In the area of significance, for New Deal resources, it had to have it was political, it was associated with the area of politics government through their association with the federal funding. The level of significance could be local, state, or national. And the period that we selected was 1933 to 1943, which is a little bit broader than some of the other states it selected. The integrity was sufficient to convey historic association through the 7 aspects of integrity: location, design, setting, materials, workmanship, feeling, and association. But of those, the aspects of association and feeling must be present, even if there was an explanation for some of the others not to be present. And the workmanship one was one that I've thought about a lot because obviously something like a post office or a courthouse is going to have entirely different kinds of workmanship than a rustic lodge like Timberline Lodge, where you can actually see the evidence of the handworking in the wood. So there's a great variety there. The general registration requirements for all resources under this MPD include the one we were just talking about. The boundaries must be located within the resource must be located within the boundaries of the state of Oregon. the period of significance must be that chronological period I identified of 1933 to 1943. The nominated property must have been built with funding provided through the New Deal, such as the PWA or WPA. And it's not a requirement that a specific program be identified simply because it sometimes is so difficult. There's so little history for some properties, as long as it's clear that it was somehow publicly funded under the New Deal. Eligible properties must retain sufficient historic integrity, as I said, to convey the property's significance. And of the 7 aspects of integrity which need to be evaluated, there must be aspects of association and feeling present. So I was going to just briefly kind of look at some of the property types. There were 2 previous MPDs that had been done for the state of Oregon for post offices. The first one was a thematic resource, significant U.S. post offices in Oregon between 1900 and 1941. And then the second one was U.S. Post Office Department facilities. That was a bit broader than just the offices, 1940 to 71. And this kind of demonstrates the overlap of one kind of resource being in the New Deal MPD, which was also in another. The big significance of post offices under the New Deal in smaller communities is often, this was the very first presence, federal presence, that the people in those communities had. Courthouses. Robert told me last night that the Clackamas County Courthouse is in jeopardy, and it's a superb example in Oregon City of the Art Deco modern architecture and the geometric details, these streamlined forms, and many of the courthouses, still function today, and they do represent civic pride, the legacy of federal investment during the Great Depression. Most of Oregon's courthouses were built under the PWA. The State of Oregon Highway Division Region Office is on the left, and the City of Toledo City Hall on the top through the WPA had, and this is, we have seen that right here in Canby, typical of a lot of these WPA city halls. There'll be a fire station right next door that's part of the same building. And it's the first to go. The fire stations, in most of those cases, the first thing to be used for something different, like an ice cream parlor. I think that the Canby City Hall is developing a National Register nomination, which we will be looking at some point soon, is what Katie said. So this is typical of a lot of the resources that need to be repurposed and given a new life and another function. And it's also being forced upon the State Highway Department building. I'm not sure it's yet found its niche. The choice of architecture was not always dictated as a matter of policy, but often was the result of scarcity of resources. And that did result in simplification of the detail and some of these structures, excuse me, changed uses again requires buildings to be adapted to the 21st century. The North Salem High School, constructed under PWA, has 2 murals, Alice in Wonderland and Arabian Nights Entertainment by Louis Bunce and Clifford Gleason, that were moved from Bush Elementary in 2007 when it had to be raised. Then the lower school there is the Sisters High School, which I put in because it illustrates the colonial revival style that was often used in schools. The State Library, we also saw that on one of Katie's slides, which was constructed at the same time as the state capitol, met the criteria of social cultural significance because it served all residents in the state, in addition to its construction under the PWA and architectural significance in its modern and stripped classical style. It had a significant architect, White House, and church as well. The bridges and road construction along the Oregon coast opened an uninterrupted highway 400 miles from the California border to Astoria. This had a great impact on the coast in economy as well as in tourism. And then on the right is an illustration of the part of the construction of either Wilson River Highway or the Wolf Creek Highway, which opened Portland to the coast for the same uses. The PWA and the WPA were the main public works program of this New Deal, and the CCC was the largest and longest. Although the project excluded CCC resources from its parameter, I included a fair amount of history of the CCC in Section E and listed many resources in Appendix C at the end of the document. And the CCC resources have to a slight extent been addressed in Gail Thrope's survey of U.S. Forest Service administrative buildings in the Mount Hood Forest. And there is, or was, and I'm not sure of the status of it any longer, but the current survey of the all the cabins and resources in the Mount Hood National Forest. But I've asked about it, but haven't heard back of what the status of that is right now. So then there were also WPA projects for recreation, and that includes other lodges besides Timberline, the Bend Skyliners Lodge, and smaller lodges like the Community Center at the Camp Mingus in Coos Bay, which used our MPD and has been approved. This committee approved it for nomination in February, as you may remember. It's something that I like to keep in mind is that there is flexibility in the document. It's possible to amend it. I did amend a brief, with Katie's help, I did amend a date in the, or no, a program in the appendix, but it does need to be approved by the National Park Service. So it takes a little while. The MPD for the New Deal resources was officially recommended to the National Park Service in February of 2022. And it marked a significant milestone in the recognition process in the completion of my required work on the MPD. And at the same time, the committee approved the state library nomination to the MPD. I also completed 5 ILS documents. The committee meeting was in Salem, but I participated by Zoom. As they moved ahead, committee member Steve Mark had said, he was the presenter, and he said he had a lot of comments and was sort of leafing through his copy of the nomination. But the committee didn't have time to go over all of those, and I wasn't going to see those in the normal course of the events, I think. So I requested of SHPO if I could see the comments that he had written on his draft. And he sent them to me, in fact, then. And I spent a lot of time working through every single one. And I have to say it was so helpful, and it vastly improved the documents as submitted, even once the committee had approved the nomination. And I just am mentioning that specifically, so we should always keep that in mind when we're reviewing documents, that there's a chance for the person who is composing these to go over those comments, or submitting, excuse me. So the submission went, I don't know if you can read that, but I thought it was fairly significant. When it went to the National Park Service, they held back on final approval, although it has its supplementary listing as of April 21st. But it's the federal projects our properties are not included through this committee. They have to be separately approved by the National Park Service. And I think, again, we saw this when we were looking at the BPA substation review in Salem. So several of the properties in Oregon's have been listed already under this MPD, and they include the state library and Camp Fingers. They include the ones that I mentioned, and we're looking forward to Canby City Hall. So the future, I think, includes, I think it's good to keep in mind that they can be amended or corrections can be made. And also, I'm looking forward to a time when the CCC resources will be, can be added or a separate document created. So in conclusion, understanding and utilizing the NPD is vital for documenting and protecting the Oregon PWA and WPA heritage through collective efforts at recognition, signage, publicity, and restoration. These historical resources will continue to enrich communities and to educate about the public works program of the New Deal. Final slide. That's a transition. It's Bonneville Dam. Okay. Please.
I think this is when the title of an MPD can be really important, because we called it, its overall title is New Deal in Oregon. So and we did that on purpose so that CCC could be added later as an associated context. Okay.
Go back.
Yeah. Right.
Beginning. Yeah, there we go. Knew that wasn't the first slide. All right, so I'm going to be talking about the MPD that was done for the National Guard armories. And while I am a committee member here today, I'm presenting on the MPD in my capacity as the Cultural Resource Manager for the Oregon Military Department. And OMD was the agency that put this MPD together. So the purpose, is there a way to get the slide larger on here? So I don't have to look dope. That's not what I wanted. Oh, perfect. Yeah, thanks. So as an agency that manages historic properties, we recognize that there was a purpose for an MPD as a tool to manage these assets when addressing our National Register of Historic Places Section 106 responsibilities. We mostly do all of our work through funding from the National Guard Bureau. We are essentially a federal agency. We do Section 106. We recognized we had a large amount of properties that needed to be managed. Previous Section 106 agreements with the SHPO had identified the need for an MPD. It had been developed from a much smaller time period. So as part of mitigation to an adverse effect, we agreed that we would expand the MPD to its current period of significance. So the need really comes from us having to manage 28 armories within that period of significance and evaluate and assessment
individually would just be too timely and costly. So having that context, like Katie talked about, ahead of time really allows us to do a better job quickly and efficiently managing these resources. And the way that I like to look at it is that MPDs are equations that you put a variable in, it runs through the equation, and at the end, it spits out an answer. Is it eligible or is it not? It's kind of how Katie described it, just in a different way, but it's a tool that we use. So the first thing that we needed to do was establish our historic context. And we did this through looking at the history of militias in Oregon, the transition from militias to the modern National Guard. I started to identify some broad patterns and themes, and then really started to narrow it down. And we did that through looking at changes in how the militia and National Guard were organized at the state and federal level. What's the word I'm looking for? How involved the Oregon National Guard was in conflicts and in its responsibility as peacekeeping and as a reserve force for the Army. And we started to develop these contexts that you can see here. And we've got these early contexts, the rise of the National Guard, the international conflict and legislative changes of the early boom years. We'll talk a little bit about that more. Then we kind of ebb down into the Depression era and World War II. There was a shift away from the state militia or the state National Guard during World War II, and everything was focused on the regular Army or active component. And then post-World War II, demobilization saw a lot of funding come in to get rid of all of this excess stuff that the active component have, giving it out to the state. And then Cold War and rebuilding of the National Guard up until the end of period of significance, 1989. From that, we came up with a handful of associated property types. One of the things that we also did is the National Guard is national, right? So there's 54 different National Guards in every single state and territory. So the Army is very regulated and regimented. So what we wanted to know is, are there any national trends that we can see in armory styles? So we made a call out to all 54 states and territories and said, give us your history on armory designs post-World War II. Are there any national trends that we could see? So that really helped winnow in on this modern style, but post-World War II, we really have these Quonset huts, the MVSB, which is the Motor Vehicle Storage Building. And before that, I know I'm kind of going backwards, but we had this castellated style, revival style, and Art Deco. And those are all sort of emblematic of the National Guard really being left up to the individual states and not really being focused from directive from Washington, D.C. So we see that in the architectural styles. So the context is first the rise of the modern guard. So that's the creation of the Oregon National Guard away from these individual militias to really have it a formal, cohesive unit. Oregon National Guard was very involved in the Spanish-American War and the Philippine-American Wars. Oregon was one of the very first states to volunteer forces to go respond. So this is where we see a peak in the use of the Oregon National Guard on a global and national scale. They were very involved in that. That continued in through the early boom years. There was federal legislation allowing for the federalization of troops. So we're starting to see this cohesion of the National Guard as a more reserve force for active duty. We're kind of dealing with that, some of that now today. You may have heard about that in the news. I'm not going to talk about it much today. So we were also involved in the Mexican border crisis and World War One. Those were direct federalization of the Oregon National Guard to respond to those conflicts. So that's where we see this this conduit into nationalization and active force. Similar to the rest of the country with the downturn in the economy, we see a little bit of an ebb in the 1930s. We had some federal relief funding that Sarah talked about. We've got a couple of armories that are still extant. We don't own them, but they were built by the PWA and the WPA. And then in World War II, there was a big shift away from National Guard funding. So we really didn't build anything during the war period, but there were still units. The majority of them were federalized into active duty and then sent off to fight in the war. We actually have one of our training facilities in Central Oregon is the BIAC training facility. Everybody thinks BIAC is an acronym. It's actually not. BIAC is a small South Pacific island where units from the Oregon Army National Guard fought in World War II. So we commemorated the training center after the Battle of BIAC. Then we move further into the last period of significance, the post-World War II and the Cold War. This is where we really see an ebb in the Oregon National Guard on a national level. Like I mentioned before, there was a lot of excess material that was pushed out from the feds to the individual states. So we got a lot of infrastructure to manage these assets, but we weren't really heavily involved in Cold War action. So no Oregon units deployed to the Korean conflict, no Oregon units deployed to Vietnam. We weren't really involved in the nuclear arms race. And this is one of the things that we really wanted to establish when we were looking at this national level of significance. Is there an association to Cold War significance? And there's, in talking with other states, there's a lot of thought out there that if it's related to the military after World War II, it's associated with the Cold War. And what we found is that's not actually really the case, that if it's related to specifically trying to quell the spread of communism through Korea and Vietnam, that's associated with Cold War. And then the nuclear arms race is related to Cold War. And Oregon wasn't involved in any of those things. So we don't really see an association with the Oregon National Guard and Cold War significance. For each associated property type, did I skip a slide? Hold on. Maybe I didn't. Okay. We've got a level of significance, and this is where the national data call really helped hone in on what our level of significance was, because originally we were thinking, well, maybe there is a national level of significance, but don't think that there is. It's really at the state level, and that's what the MPD addresses. We did not address local level significance because these individual armories are so specific to their individual community that we felt it was just too big of something to tackle in an MPD. So when doing eligibility, we develop a local level of significance individually. So with the boom years, it's, wait a minute, I am off. What is happening? Okay, that's where I want to be. Sorry about that. It's national and state level significance. There is no national level of significance that we find. Criteria consideration. So each type is addressed under each criterion for the level of significance. Some types aren't eligible under certain criteria based on the context, and that's really where the context help sort of sort that out. And we did say that armories are not eligible under criterion D for association with archaeology, because if there is going to be archaeology associated with that particular armory, we feel like it's not going to add anything more than we don't already know. And if we find archaeology that's not associated with the armory, that's going to be outside of the period of significance, and it would have to be evaluated separately anyway. And then what we actually came up with in that table is really helpful, because that's sort of our rubric that we use. This is the equation. You plug it in, you run it through this, and it really helps us determine whether or not something is significant. I know I'm running low on time, but I'm going to go quick. So here's a couple of examples. The first example here is Cottage Grove. It was constructed in 1931. It is eligible under criterion A for military and social history at the local and state level. It was locally significant individually and state level at the MPD for its association with the Oregon Army National Guard. It's also eligible under criterion C because it fits within that Art Deco armory style in the MPD. The considerations for integrity, overall, it retains really good integrity outside and inside. It retained integrity while it was in ownership of the Oregon Military Department because we ignored it. We just did deferred maintenance and didn't change anything. Then when we divested of it, the city of Cottage Grove bought it, and they absolutely love it. So like they're really taking great care of it. They're doing preservation left and right, and like it is a focus of their downtown. So they're being very, very cautious and very cognizant of how they maintain this to maintain its integrity. And like I said, it was divested to the city in 2009. They use it as a community space. It was listed individually in 2012, and then it was relisted in 2023 under the MPD. And so this is the property that we used when presenting the MPD to become active, like Katie was talking about. This was basically a slam dunk case because it was already listed. We just had to make a few adjustments and say why it fits within the MPD. The last example here is the Salem Auditorium. So this isn't listed, and technically it's not even determined eligible. Ian, you're going to see something before too long. But this is a great example of how OMD is using this MPD as a management tool. So I took the Salem Armory widget, dropped it into the equation. It plinkoed down and came out as being eligible under criterion A at the state level of significance for its military and social history. It is the only Oregon Army National Guard auditorium that we have in the entire state, so it stands alone there. It is associated with the National Guard, and it also has a local level significance under criterion A for its social history and community. It's a venue that the city uses all the time for very different types of things. Like as a early, or I guess late teen, early 20s dirtbag, like how many Battle of the Band concerts did I go to at the Armory? So lots of concerts, high school graduations are done there. It's available for rent. There's some association with the Latino population having like quinceañeras there. It's really heavily involved in the community. So it's eligible at the state level. And that's where we individually developed that state level significance and context. It's also eligible under C for state level because it fits within that modern style. And again, it's the only auditorium that we have. Typically, armories were built with a drill space inside the armory. This functions in the National Guard capacity as the drill space for the units that are stationed at the Salem Armory, which is right next door. But because this is right next to the state fair, the OMD leveraged the state to get additional funds when building this. So we took our own funds, we took state funds, and built this great big armory and this auditorium, so it would be an additional community space. And how do we use this as a planning document? Well, we're planning to do a really big renovation on this building because, again, deferred maintenance, we've ignored it for so long. We need to replace the siding. It needs new windows. It doesn't have air conditioning. As a teenage dirtbag going to battles of the band, I can attest to it being hot, sweaty, and disgusting in the summer when you're at a concert. We need to expand the restrooms, and then we just need to do a freshen up for the entire thing. And so by using this MPD during the design process and recognizing what the specific elements are that make a property like this eligible, we can direct design to most likely avoid an adverse effect. So we would be, replacing the siding with some similar material, replacing the windows in a fashion that don't change their layout or their design, but putting in more energy efficient windows, putting HVAC control units at the back elevation so you don't see them from the street. So that type of thing. So for us, this MPD is a really good management tool to appropriately and effectively manage our assets of these potentially eligible resources. And it's been really great for me as the cultural resource manager to just go to this MPD and plug in a property and have something spit out and then go tell leadership, hey, the MPD says it's this. Now we need to address it that way. They can't come back and say, why do you keep saying everything's eligible, Matt? Well, I'm not. I ran it through the MPD, which you approved, leadership. So it's a really great tool. And I think that's where it would benefit other agencies that have property types like this to develop MPDs. That is the last thing, but I'll just real quickly. The other thing that we developed this for is as we divest of these properties, they go into typically private ownership. And as Katie mentioned, anybody can use MPDs. So if we sell off one of our eligible resources, one of the things that the new owners could do would be to list it under this MPD. So it serves two functions in that it helps us manage our resources, and then private owners of other eligible armories can get their properties listed. That is it. Are there any questions? All right.
I'd like to say, I'm too often, or I don't this particular example, but they're working with chemical depot as a agency. You could do your compliance, apply to the title property at a time, or you can get it done up front. And with the really nice over the military department, this is a good cost control measure. I mean, as far as you do that work up front, and now you've got a tool, you know what you're managing, you factor that in versus, gee, what are consultants charging this year? Oh, there was a big fire, so they're charging a lot more because there's fewer of them, or just inflation or anything. So these are great tools, and I like to use OMD as an example of what can be done, especially with agencies that have armories. They know the things they've got. The one I'm currently trying to get on the hook is ODOT thing. It's a great idea, but that's been almost a 2-decade chase. So I'll keep at it.
Well, thankfully, my example of going to leadership and saying, Matt, why do you keep saying these things are eligible? They don't actually say that. They're very supportive, and they see the benefit just like you do, Ian, in developing these types of documents, whether it be the Armory MPD or the management strategy that we have at Umatilla. Leadership recognizes that you do the work up front. It may take some time and it may be fairly expensive, but in the long run, it does save time and money.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Were there any other questions? All right. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Matt. I really like that idea of an MPD as an equation that you run down. Use that.
It's with me on this computer. Nice.
All right, everybody is back, I'm told. Thank you all so much for being here and for having me. For anyone who doesn't know me, I'm Evan West. I'm the Survey and Inventory Coordinator with Oregon Heritage. It's been great to be here this morning hearing from all of you. I totally missed that there was a spot even saved for me. I'm so used to sitting in the back quietly. It was my pleasure to offer to host this presentation for Katie. A bulk of this PowerPoint was put together by Katie. And I think we had some hope that we would have a little bit more spillover from other committees and commissions, people here who haven't reviewed historic nominations before. So a lot of what is in here will be some preaching to the choir, as they say. I apologize for that, but we'll try to have some fun anyway. We wanted to talk a little bit about preservation success stories because a lot of the times we talk about preservation challenges. Honestly, it feels like an uphill battle a lot of the time to get our work done. And it's fun to get to take a look at things that have been successful and successful for some diverse reasons. So we've seen how the National Register can be part of a larger success story. At lunch, we'll hear about compliance stories. And for now, we're primarily going to be looking at some buildings that were nearly lost, overlooked, or just waiting for the right moment, and now they're experiencing a second life. That's kind of the general theme of this presentation. So before we dive into what's really in the bulk of this presentation, when I was thinking about how to talk about preservation success and what we want to talk about preservation success, I wanted to share with you all a little bit about what I do day to day as part of my being here. And a lot of the times it's talking to folks in communities across the state about what does preservation really mean? What can we do? What's possible? What haven't we done? How do we get there? And I do encounter a lot of times a sort of either stereotypical image or a classical image of what historic preservation means. And so some of the pictures on this slide represent things that I hear people talking about all the time, which tend to be house museums or architecture that you can just look at and say, I'm pretty sure everybody in town is going to say that that's a good looking building. And obviously we know that that's not necessarily what historic preservation is for or all that it is. And it's not to say that anything on here isn't highly valuable because it is, but we're trying to talk a little bit about diverse examples compared to what we see here on screen, which from the top left, we have the Deepwood Estates House Museum in Salem, the Flavel House Museum in Astoria, the Pittock Mansion in the Portland area, and the last on a clockwise motion there is the Kam-Wah-Chung State Heritage Sites. All very valuable historic places, all great examples of historic preservation, but they may not have required the same types of friends and advocacy. As things, for example, as the Malmgren Garage in Talent. I love this example. Phoenix and Talent kind of literally rising from the ashes is something that's so cool that's happened out of really severe tragedy. A little bit of background. Before I came to Oregon Heritage, I was with FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency. So I love a disaster success story, reconstruction, preservation, and we'll cover that specifically here in Talent. So the Malmgren Garage was built in 1924 by a man named, well, he was a doctor, Dr. Theodore Malmgren, and it was originally a commercial garage that served travelers on the old Pacific Highway. That highway connected Tijuana all the way to Vancouver, BC. But it was rerouted in the 1930s, where the garage then had a second life as a feed store, a lumberyard, and even a cheese factory. Eventually, it was home to the Southern Oregon Pottery Supply, run by Bill and Bonnie Morgan. And then came the Alameda Fire in 2020. I think we all remember that if you were in Oregon, if you haven't forgotten it. It was one of the few buildings still left standing downtown, such as it is. You can see the shell of the building basically was left from the fire. It was a concrete exterior that was able to survive. And I like how Katie phrased this in her notes to me. She said it became kind of an emotional anchor for the community. And that's something that is a really great way of phrasing a challenge I encountered all the time when I was with FEMA. You have a disaster, there's a rush to bulldoze and rebuild. That's what's quickest and usually what's cheapest. And it's difficult to convey following a disaster why there should be a focus still on historic preservation. It's hard to describe quickly how cultural places, heritage places, historic places can remain as an anchor of what the community was and can be again. So I really like this as an example of that exact thing. So restoration happening after 2020 made use of the federal historic tax credit. I am not a tax credit expert, so if you have questions about the tax credit programs, we'll defer to some of my colleagues in the room. They had $1,400,000 worth of qualified expenses for this restoration for federal tax credit. And I believe it also utilized the Oregon Special Assessment Tax Credit Program. Now, some of you know the state of Oregon just reinitiated the next phase of the special assessment program. I'm also not an expert in that, so we'll look forward to hopefully having a broader conversation about that with experts later. But essentially, special assessment allows property tax to be frozen at a certain level in time while you're doing historic preservation projects. The owners of the Malmgren garage took the burnt metal that was salvaged from the roof and created cutouts to look like the facade as a way of fundraising. That was really clever. Being restored with a great deal of care, they kept the exterior walls ghost signage, which I don't know if we have any view of ghost signage in the slides here, but that's really cool that that was something that survived fire and was kept on the exterior. And even the original window opening locations, those weren't adjusted. New windows were obviously built, but the windows where they were not changed. And to my surprise, this was listed on the National Register in 2024. Something that's this close to being a complete reconstruction is something that can be a challenge to justify. And so it's really impressive, the work that was done there for that under criteria A and C. And now it's home to an art gallery and a wine bar. And sort of speaking of a ghost signage of a different kind, you see the quote there from the newspaper about how on the parapet of the building, smoke and fire damage left markings that remain. A really powerful visceral reminder of what everything that this building has been through. And it reminds me that in reconstruction and preservation, we try to leave links to the past. If you've ever been to New York's Grand Central Station, you'll see the beautiful restored ceiling with a little corner of it that's still dirty from pollution the way it was when it was restored, leaving little hints of what happened in the past. This is a great example of that. The Peterson Rock Gardens in Redmond is a place I've never actually had the chance to go to, but it's high on my list. Such a cool, unique location that, again, you might not even stop at, let alone think that has intrinsic historic preservation value. But thankfully, we recognize the work of Rasmus Peterson, who was a Danish immigrant who started building in 1935, and he passed away in 1952. So a lot of work done in not an altogether long time period. He collected rocks from within 85 miles of his farm, not even 100 miles, but 85 miles of where he was. And he built miniature castles, churches, bridges, and patriotic monuments. And at its peak before his death, it was drawing over 120,000 visitors a year. In 2011, our partners at Restore Oregon awarded a preservation grant to a local consultant to do research. And then it was listed on the National Register in 2013 with the support of Oregon and SHPO. Even being listed in 2013, it was in rough shape. Thankfully, new owners came along that breathed some new life into it, Marcy Wayman and a dedicated groundskeeper named Charles Bartlemay, who removed over 40 tons of trash that had accumulated and started restoring the sculptures on site. And it's now open for visits, and Oregon Heritage recently awarded a Preserving Oregon grant worth nearly $10,000 to replace the roof on the farmhouse building, which is this building you can see here in the center, I believe. So a very fun, again, example of something that's a little bit outside. How do you categorize this exactly? Is it a site? Is it a building itself? And, you know, I didn't look at the nomination to see what criteria it was nominated under, but a fascinating example of diverse resources. Now, I stuck in this slide on the Salem Civic Center. Again, a lot of you probably recognize this because it was added in 2022 to the National Register. Constructed between 1970 and 1972, I chose this example because I think it's important recognition of architectural history that is absolutely valid and necessary, but it doesn't have very many friends and advocates in my view. As a resident of Salem, I hear from folks all the time looking for examples. They'll say, oh, I know the Civic Center they just added, but how can that be historic? It's so ugly. And it's an important reminder that beautiful, subjective as that is, or ugly, same thing, do not necessarily equate to historic or non-historic. It's an excellent example of, as the nomination says, it speaks to the monumental nature of the brutalist style. It was awarded a merit award from the Oregon chapter of the American Society of Landscape Architects way back in 1982, way back. I say that because it's another fun example of it doesn't quite meet the 50-year threshold that we normally look for in historic places. We were able to, and when I say we, all of you, were able to access criteria consideration G to advocate for the importance of the Salem Civic Center, even though it was not yet 50 years old. The old then post office, Katie called this a success story in the making. We hope so. I think so. I think it's headed the right direction. This is fun because we were just talking about public works programs. The old then post office was built in 1932 as part of President Hoover's public buildings program. So just slightly before the era that we think of as being the primary public works expansion era. As one of the first reinforced concrete buildings in the town of Bend. And it's an example of what we call stripped classical architecture. It has more clean lines and minimal ornamentation as opposed to lots of columns and domes, dental work, things like that you might see in classical architecture. It served as Bend's main post office for several decades, and it was converted into office space in the 1980s. And now it's in the middle of a $15 million renovation to turn it into a boutique hotel. It's very close to downtown Bend, as mentioned, which is an area historically lacking in enough housing, lodging, etc. And the developers are working hard to keep the original architecture details, including the limestone cladding, the terrazzo floors, interior plaster details, while adding just some touches to make it feel like an accommodating hotel. Something cool is it's slated to feature a bar called Minnie's, which is an homage to Minnie Westman, who was the first woman to transport mail west of the Mississippi River, allegedly. And it's been listed in the National Register since 1985. A great example of adaptive reuse, a term I haven't used a lot yet, but something that really is critical to, again, thinking outside the box in historic preservation. We might not always keep a historic place representative of a specific era in time, the way house museums are, but adaptive reuse allows a lot of critical elements to remain, including supporting the fact that reuse is always greener than demolition. Not always cheaper, but always going to be the greenest possible construction. There's some more pictures of the interior and its renovation. The floor plan shows it's not going to have that many rooms altogether, but just enough to make it absolutely worth the project.
Encourage you guys to look at the website. It's called the West End, the whole hotel is. Just an amazing job that they did with bringing in history into this whole recreation of this building. Their whole marketing campaign, everything is just like all of us in town are like, whoa, like the stories we didn't even know about, even being, you know, in the historian aspect of this town for so long. So really impressive, you know.
That's fantastic. I'm really glad to hear that. The Times Journal building in Condon is a location I just recently heard about the work going on, and apparently it's completed now. I didn't realize how quickly things were moving along. It was built circa 1903, started as a saloon, became a sweet shop, and maybe with a speakeasy at the back of the sweet shop, and eventually became the town's newspaper offices. The Times Journal, it's my understanding, still exists. They've moved, I think, down the block to another building, but they are still functioning as far as I'm aware. That newspaper traces its lineage all the way back to the Fossil Journal, which was founded in 1886. It's merged a few times, and now it's called, like I said, the Times Journal. And this building has been listed on the National Register since 1998, but in 2023, it received an Oregon Main Street Revitalization Program grant. And using a 1903 photograph, which is pretty impressive, the owners guided the restoration they're doing. As you can see, the arrows pointing to cast iron columns that were uncovered underneath the exterior facade, I believe, unless I've interpreted the notes wrong. They had century-old ceiling tiles that were cleaned by hand and a sagging floor that was buttressed. They found stones used to build the building came from land that one of the owner's third great-grandparents had homesteaded on. After 2.5 years of work, it reopened in 2025 as a restaurant and community space. There you can see a better view of the restored columns that were hidden by changes over time. And there's the community space today. I included this example. I know a lot of you are very familiar with the Juniper House. I think it's very unique and important because not only is the 1902 Craftsman visually appealing, that disguises some of its most fascinating and important elements of its history. As you most likely know, the Juniper House functioned as an end-of-life care facility for people with HIV and AIDS from 1987 to 89. And this is a recognition of a history that falls outside of the typically required age range, once again, which required some justification under criteria consideration G. No, I say this, I'm not actually positive Salem Civic Center required consideration G just because of its age. I apologize, I might have conflated these two in my head. The Juniper House is only the 4th resource added to the National Register in Oregon for LGBTQ plus significance. And continuing to build on these successes locally is something that I think matters and something that I try to support when possible in my role. Arguably now more than ever, because in March 2025, the federal government removed the TQ plus from its recognition category. Now they use simply LGB as a categorization with no indication that this will ever be reversed or revised again at any point in time. So local advocacy, really something that matters now. And again, this is just a fun example of architecture that somebody could point to and say, that's a really good looking house. Maybe it's historic, and it sure is, but not just because of its architectural qualities. We'll finish out with Yaquina Hall in Salem. It was rehabilitated in 2023 and it's become a low income, low barrier housing. Really successful example. It was once a nurse's dormitory on the Oregon State Hospital grounds campus. The State Hospital Historic District has Yaquina Hall as, I believe, a contributing resource, but don't quote me on that. It now offers 52 one-bedroom units of supportive housing for those with serious and persistent mental illness, those who are disabled, or those who are at risk of homelessness or currently homeless. They do give preference to tenants who are referred by local partner service agencies. Income is limited to 50% or less of the area median income, so that's very low income. And some of the units are meant to be transitional housing, while others are dedicated to those needing permanent supportive housing. They retained a lot of the historic materials and features. It's a 50,900 square foot, 3-story building, and they kept the original wooden pediment that holds a medallion with an oil lamp used to represent Florence Nightingale and nursing. Each 1-bedroom unit includes a kitchen, and the project includes a community room and other spaces for residents to connect. And they offer services supporting food stability, healthcare, and transportation. You can see in this slide what the interior of a unit looks like. I think they're really, it's really well designed. Personally, I've been in Yaquina Hall and seen the successes that it's offering. Let's see. In this case, it was financed in part with a $2.8 million value of historic tax credits. I'm not sure if that's both state and federal. And also a $10.8 million federal low-income housing tax credit. This is again another example of adaptive reuse that has been recognized locally for excellence in historic preservation for residential use and nationally as, I apologize, nationally as a residential development that, quote, best exemplifies major community impact through the use of historic tax credits. And that last photo in the upper right corner, there is the award that was received at the National Tax Credit Conference in 2024, presented to Salem's Community Planning Departments. Salem Housing Authority was the first housing authority to receive this type of award. And I did want to point out also in this aerial view, you can see just behind Yaquina Hall, the building they refer to as the Dome Building. It's currently undergoing a search process to determine what its next phase of life is going to be. So hopefully we'll stay tuned for more adaptive reuse success stories on the Oregon State Hospital campus. Whew, okay, we powered through a lot in a short time there because I know we're a little bit behind schedule. Generally speaking, just to wrap this all up with a little bit about success stories and what we look at for historic preservation, I wanted to leave you all with the words that kind of guide me as much as possible from the very first keeper of the National Register of Historic Places, who said, "It has been said that at its best, preservation engages the past in a conversation with the present over a mutual concern for the future." And I think that really well embodies adaptive reuse as a concept and why it's so important. That's Dr. William Murtaugh, who again was the first keeper of the National Register of Historic Places. All right, questions after we breeze through all of that? Okay, seeing none, thank you all. I know, again, I apologize. A lot of you are deeply familiar with those topics, but really fun to celebrate our successes in a world where sometimes we talk a lot about the challenges. Thank you.
Celebrate.
No, we put out press releases, sometimes on different things. We put it in our, every other month, an update to Parks Commission. So it exposes to the extent that people read it online, but that brief, that goes to the Parks Commission to highlight different things. We like to keep them aware of what's working versus, then finding out what we're getting sued on certain things. And I think these put our outreach group, so we tend to encourage and share, tend to put out a lot of this through their networks and whatnot. We don't post it on the website. They kind of tighten down what they want on the website just because of anything. But to your answer, yes, we do. To your question, yes, we do. But it tends to be targeted and I guess it's not regular publication for that.
I wish that we did more social media engagement, but that is for the success stories and for the things that we get nominated, get listed. I see that kind of engagement from other committees, from other states, from other areas. It's usually really well received, and so not social. Do that in such a public way here.
Yeah, we do have a social media account. It's a little bit of a capacity issue. We have invited people to take, to do Katie Henry, camp fountain, let's say. We've invited people to write things up or do some pictures. We get it like, oh yeah, I'll do that. And nothing kind of shows up, and camp has a certain amount of dedicated time to do that. If any of you would like to write something up, camp will definitely take a blurb, or if somebody in your community or circle doing stuff, you just give them Cam's information. They can write something up, Cam will edit it up and post it up. There's not a limit really on topics or other kind of things other than just kind of Cam's time to be able to go ahead. But Katie worked a little bit on that. Do you have anything to add?
So as part of our promotional plan for the National Register program, we've been running a way to schedule blog posts and social media posts about. There is a WordPress blog that Oregon Heritage has. So if you ever want to write a blog post, or if I reach out to you and ask you if you want to write a blog post, you can fill out that. Some of these properties that Evan shared too were things that came up on the technical preservation. So that not just Oregon specific, obviously, but also included other stuff. And in my post meeting email, I put that out and stuff.
If you're not already viewing our sites with blog, if you look at all of our signature lines, there's a line underneath our signature line that falls to the blog. Click on any of those. And feel free to forward that to whomever. We're not going to put all secrets, so you got some intention.
Just building on that, is when one of the sites that we have recommended for nomination is nominated, is there a general preliminary type of, hey, we just got word that this
Yeah, when we do have Katie writes press release for every single one. And in some cases where there is like a federal agency sponsoring or local community, we will often coordinate with them and let them lead out. So if their success, or especially with nonprofits, so they kind of think to leverage that themselves. So.
And they often get picked up by local. So
Yeah, like
we put those out. Yeah, Juniper House or Portland, right? Mingus Park. We've been talking a little about when that was listed, we held the press release to go out at the same time. It's the, when the community was publicizing it too, because they were having a gathering and stuff for the two nominations that were most recently listed, so the church and Baltimore's Bridge and Portland, those are, we're still waiting for coordination. So those press releases.
City of Portland, when the MPD was passed and the related historic buildings, their preservation commission and their staff member, Brandon, put on quite a show inviting elected congressional leaders and have little photo ops set up for the which you know, little secret around election time. They love doing preservation photo ops because it's generally supported broadly by the community. It's an opportunity to meet some people and something that's just broadly supported. It tends to be bipartisan and it's not confrontational. So it's often, whether it's local leaders or your professionals, it's actually relatively doable to get them to come to something like that. So we encourage a lot of our folks who do get processes to national register and have these successful rehab projects that, you know, the worst they can say is no thank you. You know, put that, you know, make an event, put that invitation out there, invite people to be part of it.
Right, moving on to the next item on the agenda. This on me. Okay.
Yes, I do. Well, I'm sure everyone knows this is Gwen's last meeting. So we thought we'd say a few things and invite all of you to share some thoughts as well. But I have some messy prepared notes here. One of the things I did is I reached out to a few staff members and asked them to share some thoughts on Gwen's service. And I guess the one thing that really came out is everyone just wanted to thank you for your 2 terms plus some change. Thank you very much for serving on the committee. We appreciate it when people hang out for us a little bit longer to kind of fill that role. So thank you so much on doing that. It's been fun having you on the committee. And the other thing that came out is, boy, when the road war. So consistently winning the award for farthest travel to a meeting. So again, thank you for that. That's not only just the time that we all spend preparing the nomination to go out, but it's that dedication. Be at the meetings and travel out and see the things. It's greatly appreciated. Thank you very much. Except for the other notable thing that say, except for the Maxville tour, which unfortunately I missed, but that's something that people still talk about. And I certainly appreciate that. And, yeah, I think your work, for me, I think your work as the director there at the Maxwell Heritage Museum, you know, kind of really informed, you know, it was your greatest strength, it really informed what we're doing here. You know, I think your perspective helped challenge a lot of the overall narratives, but you know, consistent narratives of what we were used to in origin history and those well-run pathways. And you were able to, with enthusiasm and kindness and being a great listener, kind of raise those issues and say, you know, well, what about this? Or what about that? Or is that really the narrative we want to put out there? Certainly appreciate that. I think that's a really great thing that you've done for this committee. I asked Chrissy to share something that she said is that we set the bar and it's something we'll never go back on. So really kind of shaping how we look at nominations here, work that we do. So really appreciate all of your service and the things you contributed. And I hope, you know, every so many years we get out there towards Maxwell, you just kind of swing in and say hello and see some stuff. Of course, we're not gonna expect you to drive to the coast, just say hello, but
Yeah.
but when we're in your area, we would certainly appreciate it. So again, thank you for all of your service.
Absolutely. It's been my honor and a privilege to work with all of you. I've been as nervous as I've ever been. And I've been vulnerable with so many knowledge bearers that come from different places. So I've learned a lot from each and every one of you, and it's helped me to build some of my own muscle tone in all kinds of good ways. So this is like the best committee ever.
We think so. Okay. Does anyone else want to share some thoughts on goals for this?
Just being an amazing asset, this committee, bringing in cultural awareness. We went through a little hardship a couple years ago on cultural issues in our Zoom calls, and just really made us bond, I think, a lot more and get to know each other a lot better. And fun. It was just fun. So.
What does break a party?
She does.
That's fun. I'm just glad I don't have to be the one to figure out how to fill your shoes.
Now she's
somebody.
dancing again, so dancing shoes to fill.
Yeah, I wanna put that word out there. I was thinking, it's like we need to have a picture together and I'll put it like in LinkedIn to all my friends. Hey, if you're interested, talk to me about the experience. Then try to be a part of something bigger, to support this work.
Photos though, that's something we need to do better at, is taking group photos when we're out and about. Part of our social media pushes it. Big thing that came out of the Main Street Conference was promotion, 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 and sharing what we're doing, sharing the good stuff, right? So we don't just get nailed with bad stuff. Okay, well. After that impromptu break.
One break before lunch, so that we.
Okay. Well, 1 hour break. Well, 55 minutes now. Okay. All right. We go walk around, check things out outside.
Is it a working lunch?
Yes. Yes, it is.
I just want to verify.
Yeah.
Information.
So if we could be back by 12:25, so we can start at 12:30, that would be great.
We help with the rearrangements.
Yes.
Wait.
Okay.
And so.